great to be with you tonight. Thank you to all the organizers. Let me start with a joke. Two good friends get on a hot air balloon, and the wind blows, they're well organized, but all of a sudden, something goes terribly wrong, so they don't know where they are. Finally, they manage to bring the hot air balloon close to the ground. They think they can be heard, so they shout out and they say, "Hey, man!" They see a gentleman very well dressed. "Where are we?" He looks at them. He looks at his watch. Takes his time. So after about 4 or 5 minutes, he says, "You're in a hot air balloon." And then the wind blows. They look at each other and they say, "He must be from the European Commission." "How do you know?" He says, "3 things. Number 1, he looked very serious. Number 2, it took him a long time to tell us where we are. And number 3, he told us 100% the truth, but was 100% useless." So I will continue with the concept that my 2 colleagues developed of centralization, but I will classify centralization, government, and the central bank. And I'm not here to elaborate on the consequences of having a central government or a central bank, but allow me historically to take us through some things that have happened, either in our own country here, or in the European Union, or in other countries such as China, or the former Soviet Union. Whenever we have a very powerful central government that regulates our lives and eventually taxes us, we have misallocation of resources. One of the greatest examples, certainly, will be the former Soviet Union. Then we have bureaucracy, and bureaucracy lowers productivity. Without productivity, nations go nowhere. Then we have a clientele mentality, and no better place to see the consequences of a clientele mentality than the country where I was born, and that's Greece. And then we have power issues, which brings corruption. All those forces together eventually lead a nation to stagnation. And then we have the central bank. A central bank, which is based on fiat money, I do believe in sound money, where eventually we have fiat money and no anchor in the global financial system. And because we don't have any anchor and we abandon that anchor, the semi-anchor we abandoned it in the early 1970s, you can count, probably better than I do, all the crises that erupt in the global economic system every 3 or 4 years, whether that's oil crisis or Latin American crisis, or our own stock market, or the currency crisis, or the Mexican crisis, or the Southeast Asian crisis, or the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, or the financial crisis, or the European crisis. All those crises have a common cause. And that common cause is that the global financial system has no anchor. Then, if we look at the 1990s and the bubbles that were created, or the beginning of the 21st century, the other bubbles that we have created, eventually we see one thing. We have a derivative structure of approximately $700 trillion, which is a financial bomb that sooner or later will explode again. And when that explodes, it will not be pretty. I think it will be much messier than what we had in 2008 and 2009 because we have many collateral holes in the financial system. So I believe because of centralization of too much government and too much authority in the central bank with fiat money, a crisis is brewing, both in the European Union. By the way, I consider several banks, well-known banks in the European Union, bankrupt. The names are well known. So a crisis is brewing because of pension crisis, because of an incoming financial crisis, which might start in China, a debt crisis, and certainly a geopolitical crisis that is coming. So if I had to give a particular example of this overregulation, I know that might be a dramatic and maybe a strange example, but there were studies shown that if we had stayed in the United States at the level of regulation we had in the 1960s, our GDP would not have been today $19 trillion, but rather $53 trillion. That's a lot of trillion between 19 and 53. We have failed our people. Now, if I do the same thing for the European Union, since the euro came into play, let's say the 2000, I would say that because of overregulation in Europe, and the numbers do not lie, every European would have had euros more than what they have right now. So the overregulation eventually asphyxiates economic growth, asphyxiates productivity, and eventually leads into bankruptcy, because the unfortunate thing is that bankruptcy is coming to the European Union. And because we need to open the floor, I will close with the Divine Comedy of Dante. He was taken to the underworld by Virgil, and he experienced 9 circles. So I try to take this hellish experience of Dante and put it into the European Union. So phase number 1, the limbo phase, which started with 1992, the European monetary crisis, and when eventually the pound was kicked off of the EMU. The last phase, from 1995 to the year 2000, when the Maastricht Treaty was in full implementation and the ECB came into reality. The gluttony phase, from the year 2001 to 2004, they were very hungry. The greed phase, interest rates were extremely low. Everybody had a party from 2005 to 2008. The anger crisis from 2009 to 2011. The heresy crisis, heretical views, 2012. At all costs, we're going to do whatever it takes to save the euro, a heretical currency, by the way. The violence crisis, or phase, from 2013, when the European Union country, they confiscated the deposits. That's violence. Then the fraud phase, which is still unfolding, and the fiat money of the euro. And finally, the betrayal phase, because eventually the European Union eats like the famous Rubens painting, when Kronos eats its own kids, the European Union eats its own kids, its own states, and eventually leads them to bankruptcy. Thank you.